Amina's wedding day had finally arrived. The sun rose over the small, lively village, painting the sky with golden hues. Everyone in the neighborhood had gathered to witness the most anticipated event of the year. The air was filled with laughter, the aroma of delicious food, and the sound of drums beating in rhythm. It was a celebration like no other. Inside a modest yet beautifully decorated room, Amina sat in front of a mirror. She was dressed in a dazzling white gown that shimmered in the sunlight streaming through the window. Her henna-stained hands rested nervously in her lap as her younger sister adjusted her veil. Amina smiled, trying to calm her racing heart. She wasn't just nervous, she was excited, dreaming of a future filled with love and happiness with Hassan, the man she had chosen to marry. Aside, guests gathered under a canopy of colorful fabric, chattering and exchanging pleasantries. The groom, Hassan, stood near the altar, looking sharp in his traditional attire. His eyes sparkled with anticipation as he awaited his bride. Seemed like the perfect day. But sometimes the most beautiful moments are the ones life changes in the blink of an eye. Amina took a deep breath as her sister pinned the final piece of her veil. "You look beautiful," her sister whispered with a wide smile. Amina glanced at herself in the mirror one last time. The glowing bride staring back at her hardly seemed real. Today was her day, the day she had dreamed of since she was a little girl. Inside, the celebration grew louder. The village's children ran around, throwing petals in the air while elders shared stories of weddings they had seen in the past. The energy was contagious, filling the air with joy and excitement. As Amina stepped out of her house, the crowd fell silent. All eyes turned to her, admiring her grace and beauty. Gasps of awe rippled through the gathering, followed by cheers and applause. Little girls clutched their mothers' hands, pointing and whispering, "She looks like a queen!" Amina walked slowly toward the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. Children threw flower petals along her path, and women hummed a traditional melody, blessing her with every step. Each stride brought her closer to Hassan, who stood waiting with a mix of nerves and happiness. He couldn't take his eyes off her. But as she walked down the aisle, Amina couldn't shake off a strange feeling, a shiver that ran down her spine. It was brief, like a whisper of cold wind on a warm day. She glanced over the crowd, but everyone seemed cheerful and excited. She brushed the feeling aside, assuming it was just her nerves. Unnoticed by most, a tall man in the crowd stood motionless, his eyes fixed on Amina. He wore a plain, dark outfit and blended in with the guests, but there was something unsettling about him. He didn't clap. He didn't smile. He simply stared. As Amina reached the altar, she felt a wave of calm wash over her. Hassan took her hand, his warmth grounding her in the moment. For now, everything felt perfect. The ceremony began, and the crowd's laughter and chatter quieted into an eager silence. But little did anyone know, the day was about to take a turn no one could have predicted. The ceremony began with a quiet hum of anticipation. The village elder, a wise man with a gentle voice, stood at the altar, smiling warmly at Amina and Hassan. He began reciting the traditional blessings, calling upon the couple to build a life filled with respect, love, and kindness. Amina stood beside Hassan, her fingers trembling slightly as he held her hand. His grip was firm, reassuring her that everything would be fine. Crowd watched intently, their eyes glimmering with joy for the couple. Women in brightly colored dresses whispered prayers, while children, tired from playing, sat cross-legged in the shade. But amidst the joyful gathering, that same tall man in the dark outfit moved closer to the center. He wove through the guests slowly, almost as if he were trying not to draw attention to himself. Those around him assumed he was just another relative or neighbor they didn't recognize. The elder's voice carried on, blessing the couple's union. Amina stole glances at Hassan, her cheeks turning pink every time their eyes met. This was it, the moment she had been dreaming of. As the elder invited them to exchange their vows, Amina felt the weight of emotion settle in her chest. She couldn't wait to start her life with Hassan. But just as she was about to speak, the wind picked up suddenly, rustling the decorations and making the canopy above sway. The laughter of children had stopped, and a strange, heavy silence took over the air. Amina's veil fluttered in the wind, and for a brief moment she saw something or someone out of the corner of her eye. The tall man. He wasn't sitting like the rest of the guests. Instead, he was standing, his arms crossed tightly and his gaze fixed directly on her. His eyes burned with something she couldn't quite place: anger, hurt, obsession. A chill crept up her spine, but she forced herself to look away, focusing back on Hassan. The elder, sensing the unease, paused for a moment and asked if everything was all right. Hassan glanced at Amina, concerned, but she shook her head with a small, forced smile. "I'm fine," she whispered. As the ceremony continued, small, unsettling things began happening. A candle near the altar flickered wildly before going out, though there was no breeze. A glass of water tipped over without anyone touching it. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. These could all be coincidences, they thought. Finally, the elder asked Amina to say her vows. She opened her mouth, ready to speak, when a loud voice interrupted the moment. "Stop this wedding!" the man in the dark outfit shouted, stepping forward from the crowd. Gasps erupted. Some of the children began to cry, while the women quickly moved to shield them. The man's voice was sharp, full of rage, and it echoed through the open space like a thunderclap. "Ibrahim." Amina whispered in disbelief. She recognized him now, though she hadn't seen him in years. He was someone from her past, a man she barely knew but who had once confessed his feelings for her. She had politely rejected him, thinking the matter was over. Ibrahim's face twisted with anger. "You lied to me," he shouted, pointing an accusing finger at her. "You said you'd never marry anyone else, and now you stand here with him?" His words sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. Hassan stepped forward protectively, placing himself between Amina and Ibrahim. "Leave," he said firmly. "You're not welcome here." I think so," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Ibrahim was led away, his cries of regret echoing in the background. The village elder stepped forward to restore order, his calming presence helping the crowd settle. But the joyous mood of the ceremony was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of shock. Amina's wedding day had taken an unexpected turn, leaving her and the villagers shaken but determined to move forward together. Hassan cradled Amina in his arms, his hands shaking as he tried to stop the bleeding. Her once radiant wedding dress was now soaked in crimson, a stark contrast to the joyous atmosphere that had filled the air moments ago. "Somebody call for help!" Hassan shouted desperately, his voice trembling with fear. Crowd, still frozen in shock, began to stir. A young man sprinted toward the village healer, while others huddled in prayer, their voices barely audible over the chaos. Amina's breathing was shallow, each breath more labored than the last. She looked up at Hassan, her once bright eyes now clouded with pain. I don't want to leave you," she whispered, her voice faint but filled with love. "You're not going anywhere," Hassan replied, his tears falling freely now. "You're going to be fine. Just hold on, Amina. Please." The villagers surrounded them, their faces etched with despair. Amina's mother fell to her knees, crying out in anguish. "My daughter! My beautiful daughter!" she wailed, her hands clutching her chest. Meanwhile, Ibrahim, now fully restrained by a group of men, thrashed and screamed. "She was supposed to be mine," he shouted, his voice raw with anger and heartbreak. This was never supposed to happen. The village elder approached Ibrahim, his face a mix of sorrow and fury. "You've done enough harm," he said, his voice heavy. "You've taken away the joy of this day and brought shame upon yourself. May the consequences of your actions weigh on your soul forever." The healer arrived moments later, his hands steady but his face grim. He examined Amina briefly before shaking his head. "We need to move her to the clinic immediately," he said, urgency lacing his tone. "She's lost too much blood." Hassan and a few other men carefully lifted Amina onto a makeshift stretcher. Hassan stayed by her side, holding her hand tightly, whispering words of encouragement even as his heart filled with dread. "You're going to be okay," he kept saying, as if repeating it enough times would make it true. The journey to the clinic felt like an eternity. Every bump on the dirt road made Amina wince in pain, and each time Hassan's grip on her hand tightened. "Stay with me, Amina," he whispered. "Just stay with me." But as they neared the clinic, Amina's grip on his hand began to weaken. Her eyes fluttered shut, and her breathing grew even fainter. "Hassan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for loving me." "No, don't say that," Hassan replied, his voice breaking. "You're going to get through this. We'll have the life we planned. Just hold on a little longer." Amina's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "You made me so happy," she said softly. And with that, her hand slipped from his. Hassan froze, his mind refusing to process what had just happened. "Amina," he called out, shaking her gently. "Amina, wake up. Please." But she was gone. The world around him seemed to collapse. The healer checked for a pulse and shook his head solemnly. She's gone," he said quietly. Hassan let out a cry of anguish, holding Amina close to him as tears streamed down his face. The villagers who had followed them to the clinic broke into sobs, their hearts heavy with grief. Back in the village, the celebrations had turned into mourning. The once colorful decorations now felt like mockeries of the tragedy that had unfolded. The air was thick with sorrow as the news spread. Ibrahim was taken away by the authorities, his cries of regret echoing in the distance. But his punishment could never undo the damage he had caused. Amina's wedding day, meant to be the happiest day of her life, had ended in unimaginable heartbreak. The village was consumed by a heavy silence the morning after the tragedy. The vibrant decorations still hung from the houses, but their bright colors now felt mocking, a painful reminder of what had been lost. Amina's laughter, which had once brought joy to every corner of the village, was now just a memory. Hassan sat quietly near Amina's grave, his once hopeful eyes now hollow with grief. The grave was freshly dug under the shade of a large mango tree, surrounded by flowers left by the villagers who had come to pay their respects. Hassan's trembling hands rested on the soft earth, and he whispered words no one could hear. Perhaps he was speaking to her, telling her all the things he didn't get the chance to say. The villagers, too, were in mourning. Amina had been a beloved figure, known for her kindness and warmth. People gathered in small groups, recounting her life, her dreams, and the cruel twist of fate that had taken her away. Mothers held their daughters close, fathers spoke of protecting their families, and the elders sat silently, offering prayers for the soul of the departed. Ibrahim, the man responsible for the tragedy, had been taken into custody. His cries of regret echoed in the villagers' minds, but no one could forgive him. "He let his anger destroy her," an elder said quietly. "And now he will carry that weight forever." Hassan, however, was lost in his own world of grief. The plans they had made together now felt like broken promises. The house they had dreamed of building, the family they had hoped to raise, it all seemed meaningless without her. But even in his sorrow, Hassan knew he had to honor Amina's memory. He began visiting her grave every day, bringing fresh flowers and sitting in silence. "You'll always be with me," he whispered one day, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "I'll carry you in my heart, no matter where life takes me." And so the village slowly began to heal. The tragedy left a scar that would never fully fade, but it also brought a reminder of how precious life is, and how love, even when lost, can leave behind a light that never truly fades. Weeks turned into months, and the village slowly began to regain its rhythm, though the memory of that tragic day lingered in everyone's hearts. Amina's story became a tale often spoken in hushed voices, a reminder of how fragile life can be and how easily a moment of joy can turn into sorrow. Hassan's visits to her grave became a daily ritual. Each morning, he would bring fresh flowers and sit under the shade of the mango tree, sometimes speaking softly, other times simply sitting in silence. The villagers respected his grief and left him to his memories, but many admired his resilience. Despite the pain, Hassan found solace in keeping Amina's memory alive. One day, the village elder called a gathering to reflect on the events that had transpired. He stood before the crowd, his face heavy with wisdom and sadness. "What happened to Amina is a lesson for all of us," he began, his voice steady. "It teaches us the importance of addressing our emotions, our anger, our heartbreak, before they consume us." The elder's words resonated with many. Parents began teaching their children the importance of forgiveness and understanding, warning them about the dangers of letting jealousy and bitterness take root in their hearts. As time passed, the village transformed its grief into a collective effort to support one another. Amina's memory became a symbol of kindness, love, and resilience. Every year, on the anniversary of her wedding day, the villagers gathered under the mango tree to honor her life. They lit candles, said prayers, and reminded themselves of the lessons her story had left behind. Though Amina's life had ended too soon, her spirit continued to inspire those who knew her. In their hearts, she would always remain the radiant bride who brought light into their lives, even on the darkest days.